I don't know. Anyway, let's get into our main topic here, and that is beta brand podcast theater. And this is a subject that I've been thinking about for years, and that is podcast theater in general. And when this article came into play, I decided, well, let's talk about this a little bit here. This is about, and this is over on Forbes.com. Beta brand Chris Lindlad is created a podcast theater. So basically, you go into the podcast theater, you sit down, and you listen to people podcasting. That's pretty cool. And I've seen it. I've done live remote podcasts before, and they're fun. And sometimes they're live streams, sometimes they're audio. But you go to this place, and then you can listen to a podcast or two. And I think that this is actually going to be part of a new genre, and that is podcast theater. So, maybe it's not your local bar. Maybe it's more of, a small theater, small bookstore, or something like that. They say, come down on June 23rd and listen to these local podcasters talk their show in front of a studio audience. And you go, I'll do that. I like this podcast, or I'm interested in finding a new podcast. So I'll go down to this theater and I'll just check out people doing their podcasts. And even in conferences they do this. They give people the theater time, and they'll have a rig set up for them to do their podcasts on, and then they'll come in, they'll bring in their USB drives or their SD cards or whatever to capture the audio, or it sends on. I don't know how, it depends on how the system does this. They have their allotted time, they do their podcast at the show, and then go from there. And then, of course, some people just do it independently. They'll be on the show floor, and they'll get together and say, hey, we're doing the podcast right from the show floor. So, but with theater podcasts, you can make a night of it. Maybe as a dinner theater. Maybe some of these places that have dinner and events. You sit at a table and you have dinner, and somebody's talking on a podcast. That's a possibility. Maybe it's a lunchtime thing. Lunchtime podcast educational series. Why not? That would be really fun. Lots of different ideas on that. So I put up a question in the poll notes. What would you go to podcast theater? Now, different scenarios. First scenario is, this is an evening event. Starts at 7, just like a concert. And you get to listen to 3 sets of podcasters, famous podcasters, and their shows. And then it's kind of like a theater situation. So, one person does their hour-long show, brings on the guests or whatnot, and then you take a small break, and the next person comes on, does their show, take a break, stuff like that. Evening event, big theater, 1,000 people maybe. Second event, lunchtime. How-to type podcasting situations in a bookstore or someplace that you can bring your bag lunch into, and you can listen to the podcast as you're eating lunch and just consuming it like you would a session at a conference or something like that. So you got that session. And then, of course, third one is you're in a bar and somebody, maybe a couple sports podcasts or something like that are going, and they just take an afternoon at the bar. So these are different situations where podcasting can come into play. Now, when you talk about a bar situation, a lot of the times it's going to be loud and noisy. Other people are going to be in there. Somebody's going to try and play the jukebox and things like that. So that might not be the best situation for that. But I know that there are some bars that have side halls, business rooms, or concert halls that are pretty much empty during the day. So you rent that out and you have like 4 or 5 podcasts. You can sell tickets, or you can say it's absolutely free, and go from there. And I don't know if you want to do a 2-drink minimum in the middle of the day at a bar, but it's how you set up your podcast theater. Podcast theater can have a lot of cool stuff coming to it, because it can be more than just theater. And if you really think about it, A talk show is kind of like a podcast. So if you wanted to go see The Tonight Show or Late Night with Stephen Colbert or Jimmy Kimmel or Seth Meyers or Conan or all these shows like this, you go in, you get your seat, they do the show, somebody warms up the audience, comedian warms up the audience, maybe the band plays a couple songs, everybody gets everybody in the mood, talks about how with those lights that say laugh pop up, please laugh, try to don't overdo the laugh, but if you feel that it's funny, just laugh and just have a good time. And then of course they do their show, and then they thank the crowd, and then everybody disperses. That's a good right there, that's a good hour and a half show right there. So you get 2 or 3 of that like that, and you just keep doing that. Boom, you've got podcast theater. Good 2 to 3 hours worth of content. And they're not going to see a band. Maybe there's a musician on the side or something like that, but they're not going to see a band. They're going to see people talk like I'm doing right now. And sometimes it's without script. Sometimes it will be with script. But the question is, would you do it? Would you do it? I really see in the next few years, if not a lot sooner, that podcast theater is going to be a thing of nightlife. Podcast theater will be a thing in afternoon. I am surprised that groups like the Rotary Club are not doing Rotary Club podcasts during their shows. And maybe they are, because there's a lot of Rotary Clubs throughout the world. But if they had a more centric thing where people would get onto audio or video and they do like a presentation, like a TED Talk or something like that, and they put it out as a podcast on a regular basis, they could have a lot of content into, and of course more interest, so people would go to their Rotary Club meetings and they would become more involved. So podcast theater, it's a great idea. I'm very excited. I will have to see. This one is in I think this is somewhere in California, right? So it's it's a data provider, of course, and they have over 700,000 podcasts globally. And I've talked about other companies that are starting to work around U.S. tours, take podcasts, kind of like musicians would do on a USO tour or something like that. You'd have like 4 or 5 bands, and they'd play Chicago, then Minneapolis, then Detroit, then New York, and they'd do the circuit, and then one band would exit at a certain point, another band would come in, and then they'd do the circuit like that. Podcast theater could be the exact same way, and you could localize it to a state level, you could localize it to a city level, or nationwide. So I could take my podcast on the road, and then you could see how to podcast in Biloxi, Missouri. You could see my podcast in Orlando, Florida, and stuff like that. And of course, my podcast would be my podcast, and Joe Schmo and Fred Bean and this guy right here, this person right here. She's got an awesome podcast every single week. She talks about ginger people and the lives. She's got awesome stories of ginger-haired people, and what they do in their world. So you got to listen to her podcast, or go over to this guy's podcast. His podcast is about, what is his podcast? Oh yeah, his podcast is about enterprise technology and how you can put everything into the cloud. So that's an awesome podcast. And then of course, if you're listening to the audio, I'm going through pictures. This little girl right here, she's got an awesome podcast about kids' toys. So, and of course, that's on this person does not exist.com. I got to do more of that. That's a lot of fun. So anyway, what would you do? Would you go to podcast theater? Let me know that the poll's in the show notes and go from there. So I think that we're gonna round that up from this week for How to Podcast. Thank you guys very much for coming to the show. If you want to know more, go visit me over at geekazine.com. Think Magazine, put in a geek. Facebook.com, Twitter.com, Geekazine, Pinterest.com. And you like the show, tip the show over at PayPal.me or Venmo. We've got links to that, and I'll make sure Venmo is in the show notes as well.